Uh, Thank you very much, John, Paul, Sven, and colleagues for inviting me here. It's great to be back in Norway, to see some old friends, but also to recognize the fact that Norway for so many years has been a leader in sustainable development, not just because of the aid levels and the aid composition that John has talked about, but because for decades, I think, the Norwegian government and the Norwegian people have supported civil society all around the world. And it's great to be here at a time when you're talking about the next phase of your policy development and how Norway itself thinks about how to support civil society and achieve sustainable development. And of course, it's also great to be in a country that's at the cutting edge in terms of implementing the Sustainable Development Agenda. And I hear that your Prime Minister is going to present your own report to be tabled at the high-level political forum tomorrow. So it's great to be here for all of those reasons. What I want to do, as John said, is to provoke you a little bit with some observations, drawing from my experience of 3.5 years working for CIVICUS, the Global Civil Society Alliance. I'm going to tell you a little bit about CIVICUS, which was founded about 20-odd years ago to strengthen citizen action and civil society all around the world. We are now a membership-based alliance with members in more than 170 countries. Many of our members are national platforms or associations of NGOs, but we also have individual organizations that are active members of the CIVICUS family, as well as individual activists. Our headquarters are in Johannesburg, South Africa, but we have offices in Geneva, London, and New York, and we have people working from home or within members all around the world. We tend to work in 3 areas. We do a lot of knowledge generation. There's a lot of research that we do into the state of civil society. We produce national level reports on conditions for civil society. We do a lot of, sadly, we spend a lot of our time trying to push back on restrictions placed by governments and others on the activities of civil society. And of course, we do a lot on the international level to influence the global processes around civil society. We're funded by a mix of development agencies and some private foundations and, of course, member contributions. So that's about Civicus. If you want to know anything more, civicus.org. If you'd like to join as an individual or organizational member, you can find lots of details on the website. Let me start with a definition of civil society. The arena outside the family, the state, and the market, which is created by individual and collective actions to advance shared interests. So it's important for me to just put that out there because for us, civil society is much beyond organized NGOs or non-governmental organizations. Civil society for us is about voluntary and collective action, about social movements, about informal or voluntary groupings. And it's certainly beyond development. So often in conversations like this, we talk through the development lens, and I suspect we will for most of this afternoon, but I think it's important at the outset to remember that we're not talking about just organized bits of civil society, and we're not talking just about development, but about broader civil society. I want to share with you 4 trends that we've observed in our work talking to and working with civil society around the world. The first, and perhaps most worrying, is this. Last year alone, my colleagues documented threats, serious threats, to civic space in 109 countries around the world. So here we are, almost 70-odd years after the enactment of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which guarantees our freedoms to assemble, associate, and express ourselves. But we live in a planet where 6 out of 7 people live in a country where one or more of those freedoms, we believe, is under threat. And that is a worrying trend because in 2014, the equivalent number of 109 was 96. So in more and more countries around the world, we're worried about conditions for civil society, or civic space, as we call them. And what's going on? Well, we have some very familiar attacks and intimidation of activists that many of you will be familiar with. People are locked up for daring to speak truth to power. People's offices are being raided because they're daring to question government policy. People are being killed because they're daring to highlight corruption or questioning natural resource extraction. All around the world, in far too many places, we're seeing very traditional attacks and intimidation of civil society. But we're also seeing impediments to the rights to assemble, protest, and express ourselves. And that is happening not just in places where you might expect, but in countries like the United States, where last year we saw what we thought, what we would say are unjust or unfair intrusions into the right to peaceful assembly. If you think about limits to media and internet freedom, something like 60% of people on the planet live in a country where it's still illegal or punishable to criticize the government, the ruling party, or the monarchy in some form or another. You know, one test of the fact that we still live in a world where some of these basic freedoms are not guaranteed. And perhaps worryingly, in many, many parts of the world, there are gagging clauses on the activities of civil society. We saw it very recently in the United Kingdom, you know, arguably the mother of parliamentary democracies, where the Cabinet Office said in a directive that no civil society organization that receives money from the government can use that money to lobby the political process in any way. Now, we think that's wrong because that goes against the independence and vibrance of civil society, the rights of civil society to speak out and engage in political processes, but it's also stupid policy because you want people working with homeless people to be able to use that experience to inform policy making. You want people who have direct experience of gender rights to inform gender policy making. And so this idea that somehow charities should stick to just delivering things and not engage with policy making or policy shaping is wrong. And in many, many parts of the world, we're seeing this trend, including, I was in Denmark last week, where there are hints of that starting to be introduced, that if you would receive government money from the Danish government, you know, a bastion for many, many decades of free speech and open democracy, we're seeing some worrying trends. And so this is not happening just in dictatorships, it's happening in very mature democracies, and it's happening not just by states clamping down on civic space, but other actors. Fundamentalist religious organizations, big businesses who are in collusion with political elites who don't want an independent civil society to cast a light on what's happening on environmental exploitation or resource extraction. And so we live at worrying times, we would argue, when it comes to civic space. If you move beyond the political conditions that enable civil society to function, the basic freedoms, and look at the operating environment, or the so-called enabling environment for civil society, then we think there are things that we need to worry about here too. In a raft of countries, in a range of countries, we're seeing, for example, the introduction of complex registration requirements. So non-governmental organizations that want to register themselves or work in particular areas are having a whole range of registration and administrative requirements thrown at them, and that those requirements are then used to destabilize or threaten civil society. In Kenya, for example, last year, the government threatened to deregister some 950 NGOs who it claims had not filled out all the paperwork adequately. If you look at those 950 NGOs, a large number of them happen to be organizations working on democracy, good governance, and human rights, and who had been critical of the government. In India, the world's largest democracy, we've seen a range of new measures aimed at stifling civil society through red tape, through bureaucracy. And of course, an Indian minister said to me recently, you know, you don't understand. What we want is, we want people to play by the rules, and that's why we've instituted these regulations. It so happens that those regulations don't apply to the private sector, to companies. But it seems only to NGOs, and particularly to NGOs who dare question government policy. And I could go on. The registration process itself has become the sort of latest battleground for governments who want to stifle civil society. And of course, there are countries in which civil society is restricted in terms of what it's able to work on. In Zimbabwe, for example, civil society organizations that work on human rights or good governance are heavily restricted because the government's very sensitive about these sorts of things. And then, perhaps the most popular tool in the restrictive governmental toolbox, which is around foreign funding. In country after country, restrictions are being introduced on the ability of local civil society to access money from abroad. The country that pioneered a lot of this is, of course, Russia, where the Putin administration for years has now required Russian civil society organizations that receive money from abroad to register themselves and declare themselves as foreign agents, using the same word, I'm told, as in Russian as spy. So in all documentation, they have to register themselves as spies and undergo extra checks. And this has infected the world, this trend. So we're seeing similar regulations in Ethiopia, of course in Israel, where the parliament just recently introduced a new law doing the same thing, but it so happens that the sorts of organizations who are going to have to declare themselves as foreign agents happen to, again, work on issues to do with human rights, good governance, Palestine. We have another worrying trend in terms of the enabling environment for civil society, which is that many, many donors are moving from a model of grant-making, where civil society is enabled to choose what it wants to work on, to determine its own impacts and policies, to a model of contracting. That civil society becomes just another vehicle to deliver aid or deliver development rather than as an empowered agent in its own right. And finally, to add to this mix, in the last few years, we've seen, again, a range of measures to combat money laundering or anti-terrorism measures, which have made financial transactions between or within civil society incredibly difficult. We saw it last year very directly, where we wanted to support a women's rights organization in Khartoum in Sudan. We were told by our funders, who were a large, progressive American foundation, that we were not allowed to move money into Sudan because it was a state sponsor of terrorism, according to the US government. And this small but valuable grant that was supposed to support gender equality in Khartoum couldn't go through because of these legislations. And that's a minor example of how the life of civil society is being cramped by many anti-money laundering measures. So, civic space under threat, the enabling environment for civil society getting more difficult in more places around the world. And I want to turn to some challenges within civil society. Resourcing, something that John has mentioned. In a crude manner, it might be useful to differentiate between challenges that are happening in the global north and those that are happening in the global south. What we're seeing in the global north is that there are, in some places, cuts to aid or overseas development assistance, or even if there are not cuts in the volume of aid, there are moves away from civil society, so that the $12 billion out of $150 billion or so of total ODA volume last year, we worry is under threat in many countries, or there's been a reallocation of ODA resources to other expenditure, refugee reception, or in some cases military expenditure. So even if it hasn't happened in any dramatic sense yet, the trend is worrying to the extent that resources, valuable and limited resources for civil society, may be being shifted to other priorities. And then there's the issue of what I call log frame-itis, which is a disease that has swept the development world in recent decades. And it's the intent of it is fantastic, which is we want results, we want to show what we've been able to achieve through public or taxpayer money. The impact has been horrible in many ways, that so many wonderful civil society actions and initiatives have had to be morphed, projectized to fit in with donor log frames. That the social transformation that we want to achieve, that most of us in civil society have set out to achieve, has had to be fitted into the log frame. And no wonder then most of us spend our lives sort of trying to achieve incremental change in year or 2 year long projectized bundles and failing to achieve the sort of systematic or systemic impact that we want. And then this idea of corporatization, so coupled with the contract-based approach to development, is the fact that so much of development is becoming corporatized. The US example is perhaps leads the way. Last year, of the $4.8 billion of USAID contracts that were issued, only a quarter of it went to civil society. 3/4 of that money went to large corporate conglomerates and large corporate actors. And so here we are, perhaps those of us in the sort of development sector, thinking naively that development is the bastion of these do-gooding NGOs. That's no longer the case for many a donor. That once you start to see the world in terms of impact and metrics, and once you start to see the world in terms of being status neutral as to who delivers that aid, then inevitably you give $9.5 billion open-ended contracts to a consortium of private sector actors, as USAID did recently. And so this is deeply worrying if you're in civil society, because for us, for many of us in development and in civil society, we think that that civil society is both a means and an end in itself. That civil society is not simply here to deliver development, but it's part of the social transformation, it's part of the institution building that sustainable development has to be about. And in many, many parts of the world, and many, many donors, I see a worrying trend where the art of transformation, which we're involved in, is being killed by what I call the science of delivery. And one final issue around resourcing, which is around donor fatigue or fundraising fatigue, which is in many parts of the global north, private giving seems to be at saturation point. So in many parts of Europe, something like 80% of people are giving to charity or giving to non-governmental organizations. It's unlikely that volume of private giving is going to go up, which means that we are in a very difficult scenario where those of us who are competing for these resources are competing for a dwindling pot of money, which then has a difficult implication of raising the costs of fundraising that brings us into this sort of unhealthy competition with each other to secure resources. And again, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the UK context, where recently this has become a very politically charged issue because charities have been accused of simply going after the money, and there was a tragic death of an old woman who'd been, the accusation was that she'd been harassed by charities calling her and calling her and calling her, chasing her money, that she gave up and committed suicide. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that was used in the British media as a tragic example of this competition between charities going wrong. And then if we move to the Global South, the funding context is perhaps even more acute, which is the statistic that John mentioned, that only about $1.5 billion of that $12 billion spent to or through civil society goes to southern actors directly, i.e. 1% or so of all ODA, means that southern-based civil society is receiving very little direct funding. That most ODA money, for example, still goes through northern funding intermediaries, organizations that are asked to channel this money into the Global South, which then by implication means that those organizations in the Global South have very little unrestricted income. Most of them are dependent on as sub-grantees down the line, down the funding line, and therefore it's more difficult to build the long-term institutional strength. The sorts of resources that have enabled northern civil society to mature and consolidate, the unrestricted income that allows you to invest in your services, invest in your staff, has become more difficult, or is very difficult to reach in parts of the Global South. And of course, if you overlay that, onto that, the fact that many governments are restricting the access that these organizations have to foreign funding, we're in some really difficult terrain. Just on Friday, there was a study released that shows that in India, where these foreign funding restrictions have been introduced, a study showed that of 700 progressive NGOs, those working on development and social services of one form or another, have had their income halved in the last year. because of restrictions to foreign funding. So already there's too little, I would argue, resources going into southern civil society, and now when countries like, or governments like India restrict those flows, that little amount becomes even smaller and harder and more politically contentious to get. And of course, the flip side of this, domestic resource mobilization, which is the southern philanthropists or southern publics supporting this work, of course, is starting to happen in many, many parts of the world. But we've just been doing some research on this, which suggests that this is it's unlikely that any time in the near future, even in middle-income countries, will local philanthropy and local giving step up to replace foreign funding flows. It's happening in some relatively neutral service delivery areas, but when it comes to change-seeking organizations, social justice, rights, good governance-based organizations, they are finding it very difficult to convince local donors to take the political risk of supporting their work in those countries. I've been living in South Africa recently, a middle-income country. It's graduated to middle-income status with huge numbers of wealthy people. But many, many of the South African rights-based organizations and good governance organizations are struggling because those people are not willing or prepared to support politically controversial causes in South Africa in the way that foreign funders were able to do. So one last trend. Again, another internal one, which is about the uneven landscape within civil society. And this uneven landscape is my polite phrase that I use. It strikes me, this is my provocative bit, that what's happening in civil society is that money, power, and profile is also held by a relatively few actors. And this is a universal statement because I see this happening in the global north and in the global south. That there's this movement towards those relatively few actors being able to get bigger and bigger, because they have the public profile, they have the access to policymakers and get the influence, and before they know it, they get more resources because they have a better profile, and before you know it, they start to crowd out smaller actors. And for those of us who believe that the beauty of civil society lies in its diversity, this is a worrying trend. We don't want an oligopolistic civil society. We want a diverse and vibrant civil society. And of course, another implication of this is that with size, it strikes me from my observation as an outsider, comes obsessions with brands and competition. That so many of our bigger NGOs spend their time worried about what happens to their brand, or what the competitors are doing in terms of their marketing campaign, or what are the competitors doing in terms of their grants proposal. And that's healthy in some respect, because we want the discipline of competition in some cases. But I have a fear that we've backed ourselves into a very unhealthy corner, where this sort of corporatized behavior is overtaking much of civil society. And of course, the problem with size becoming this important, overlaid on the north-south division, is that money may trickle down. So you might be able to sub-grant and put money through others, but power doesn't. That ultimately, if those who control the money hold the power, and we may try to build in systems that try to counter that, but there is a danger here that by pushing money through a few big players who may then be responsible for on-granting it or sub-granting it, we may get ourselves into a challenge with this. And of course, another observation that I have is that, and I'm lucky enough to be able to go to many, many international fora and speak at events like this, but I meet very few strong Southern voices. That the normative landscape in civil society, those who capture the headlines, those who get quoted in the media, tend to be from northern-founded, northern-funded, or simply larger organizations. So again, this idea of having a diverse civil society, I think, is under threat in many ways, whether it comes to money, power, profile, or simply in terms of voice and representation. So, those are 4 trends that worry me. But I don't want to leave you depressed, so I want to just leave with a little bit of optimism, just to keep you optimistic. The good news is trust in civil society remains incredibly high. All of the research that I've seen in this suggests that people all around the world continue to trust civil society more than governments, business, media. And that this is consistent and stable, that people in general, North and South, trust civil society to speak for them, to deliver services more effectively, and so on. I don't know quite why that's been... That, again, we talk about political apathy, particularly in the global North, but I think we're misreading what's going on. There is an apathy towards political institutions, political parties, and so on, but there, I don't think, is a reduction in the thirst for participation. In fact, I would argue the contrary, that one of the biggest things going for civil society is that young people all over the world, particularly in the global South, have a thirst for political participation. They want to shape their futures, they want to be involved in political processes and decision-making at all levels. They also have new forms of activism and organizing that allow them to do that, to express themselves through new ways of organizing and mobilizing. And of course, that's helped by new technology and new tools that allow for people to participate and engage in new creative ways. So right up the top, I don't quite know why that did that, but I've also said that civil society is at the cutting edge in many areas. This is one of my favorite photos, the one, I hope you can see it, in Paris last year around the climate talks. That's citizens organizing around the 100% renewable targets. You know, that's an example, climate change, where civil society has been at the cutting edge, at the vanguard of the struggle for sustainable development, for sustainability, have been pushing our leaders to take action. And we should be proud and recognize the successes that we've had in changing the politics of climate change, for example. It's not good enough. I'm not saying we should be complacent, but in many social and environmental issues, civil society continues to be at the cutting edge. On fundermediaries, the good news is I think there is a new generation of fundermediaries, these funding intermediaries that are growing up to be able to move money and power, hopefully, in more effective ways. The women's movement, I think, are leading the way. There are fantastic examples of regional funding, pooled funds, and of participatory grant making, where donors can pool their money into something like the African Women's Development Fund, but then it's a group of African leaders, of civil society leaders in Africa, who are making the effective decisions about where that money goes. There's just last month at the World Humanitarian Summit, there was a new Southern pooled fund created for humanitarian action, where in the humanitarian sector, the proportion of ODA going to Southern or direct of local responders is even worse. It's 0.2%. And so it's a really welcome sign that we're starting to see this emergence of these new... And finally, here we are in a country that's volunteered to be first off the rank in terms of the Sustainable Development Goal evaluation. I do believe this is a very encouraging and optimistic new agenda for civil society, amongst others, because here we are with a new agenda that's universal, that is broad, that's ambitious. It may not be legally binding, and there are lots of problems in it, but I think it gives us a fantastic platform as civil society to organize and mobilize ourselves, especially at the global level, especially from the starting point of solidarity, which at the end of the day is what founded most of the institutions and organizations that I suspect many of you work for, rather than something around delivery and results only. And I think this gives us a wonderful platform to make a really big difference on achieving a more just and sustainable world by 2030. Thank you very much.